We've heard these murmurings of these checkpoints that Israel's putting up, that they're surrounding Rafah, and it seems like this horror show is what's next. This is written by Jonathan Cook, and he says Israel-U.S. Gaza plan stares us in the face. And by the way, you will not get this plan, these revelations from your mainstream media. Oh, this is exactly what they're trying to hide. It says one does not have to be a fortune teller to understand the Israel-U.S. game plan for Gaza runs something like this. Step one, in public, Biden appears tough on Netanyahu, right? We've all seen this happening right now. Urges him not to invade Rafah and pressures him to allow more humanitarian aid into Gaza. Please send some more sandwiches to the people you're genociding, and then we'd be fine with it. That's basically what Biden is saying.
Sorry, I just wanted to, because I wanted to know who this dude is. He was based in Nazareth for 20 years as
British journalist,
and is an expert in the Israel-Palestine conflict, and has written 3 books on it. So this isn't just like some schmo who's like pontificating about this. Like, he's an expert in this topic.
Number 2, already the White House is preparing the ground to subvert its own messaging. Basically, its own messaging is bullshit. It doesn't actually, they're tough on Netanyahu as he commits genocide. As we send weapons every 36 hours, Biden administration is wagging their finger. Ooh, stop genociding. But here's more bombs to do it. Biden administration insists that Israel has offered an extraordinarily generous deal to Hamas. One that Washington suggests amounts to a ceasefire. It doesn't. According to reports, the best Israel has offered is an undefined, quote, period of sustained calm. Even that promise can't be trusted. Israel has not actually offered a ceasefire. They're trying to make it look like they have so that Hamas can be blamed.
I'd also just like to point out that, like, okay, the bombing is horrific. But even if and when the bombing, obviously it will eventually, but when this bombing stops, people are still starving. So, like, even if there's a ceasefire, which, by the way, like, calls for ceasefire are now just like ridiculous. Like, it's like calling for a Band-Aid when somebody's head's been blown off. People are starving. There was a recent, oh gosh, who was it? It wasn't the UN. That basically said that, like, all of the kids, UNICEF, all of the kids are now, like, in Rafah, are basically like malnourished or starving.
Actually, I'm glad you brought that up. I was going to bring that story, but it's too fucking hard.
Horrific. It's too fucking hard for me into it.
No, it's too hard for me to even to pull up the article. But basically, every child that still exists, still alive in Gaza, is either starving, wounded, sick, diseased, just about every single one.
This has to be unacceptable to the world that a 9-year-old girl who was just visiting her grandparents ends up with such a traumatic injury that cannot be treated, and she's still waiting for help.
So, yes, bombing needs to stop fucking, like, months ago, and also people are starving. So it's like this bullshit idea of, like, a deal that's very generous. No, if I'm starving and you're like, great, well, now your house is intact, that doesn't help me eat.
If Hamas accepts this deal, this kind of fake deal from Israel, and agrees to return some of the hostages, the bombing eases for a short while, but the famine intensifies.
Oh, I just said that.
Yeah, this is what you said.
Me and Jonathan are on.
You smell what he's cooking.
Okay, please.
This will simply delay, he says, for a matter of days or weeks, Israel's move to step 5, which is also what I've been saying for a long time now, is that Israel wants ethnic cleansing no matter what. They don't care about the hostages. And in fact, getting a hostage deal where all the hostages are released harms Israel's plans, because then it looks worse that they are continuing the ethnic cleansing. Exactly. But so if they accept the deal, then Israel continues starving them and will cease bombing for maybe a little while, but probably pick it up again later. Step 4, if, as seems more likely, Hamas rejects this deal, it will be painted as an intransigent party and blamed for seeking to continue the war.
By the way, I'd just also like to point out that this is always how Palestinian, whether that's PLO or Hamas or whatever, have always been painted as the difficult party. Oh, you won't accept this deal. When, if you look at the history of quote unquote deals, a lot of times Palestinians haven't even been allowed at the table. They certainly have not been allowed to include language such as Palestine or Palestinians. So how can you have a deal when you're erasing an entire person's existence? So this idea that that they're being difficult is just a further a further way to try and take victimhood, for Israel to take victimhood in the face of their ongoing genocide. And it's totally disgusting and despicable. I hate that sometimes people are like, well, even Hitler, but it's like, the Nazis were very clear that they were the aggressors. They're like, yeah, we're doing this because you guys are terrible and we hate you. And, Roma and Jews and gay people should all be gassed because you're just disgusting. And we're the strong aggressors. What Israel is doing is trying to play the victim while being the perpetrator of genocide. And so this is like a way like more twisted and deeper psychosis and extreme terroristic perspective to have. And of course, it's one that's upheld by corporate media. And, we've talked about in the past that corporate media is having a hard time keeping that together, but it is still the kind of the perspective that is generally held here in the U.S.
The fact that Israel pretends to be the victim during this is really repulsive. Then as he moves forward in what he believes, and I agree, is the plan of Israel, the U.S. will announce that Israel has devised a humanitarian plan to go forward. Step 5, this will give the U.S., Europe, and the region the pretext to stand back as Israel launches the long-awaited assault on Rafah. As most of you know, he doesn't throw this in here, but Rafah is basically where almost the entirety of the population of Gaza now is, because they've all fled south, which is what Israel made them do and told them to do. And now they're in Rafah, the last remaining southern city, and it's like 1.9 million people or something are there, packed into this little place. And now Israel says they're going to bomb that. The assault on Rafah will begin. As Middle East Eye reports, Israel is building a ring of checkpoints around Rafah. This is really the key point and perhaps the most horrific part. Women and children will be allowed out through those checkpoints if they can reach a checkpoint before Israel begins carpet bombing and killing them along the way. Step 7, all men in Rafah and any women and children who remain will be treated as armed combatants. If they're not killed by the bombing or falling rubble, they will either be executed or sent to torture chambers. No one will mention in the mainstream media that any Hamas fighters who were in Rafah were able to leave through the tunnels. Really, they're just going to end up killing thousands and thousands of men who had essentially nothing to do with Hamas.
And even if they did,
it's still a war crime. It's still amazingly horrific. These are still unarmed people, and this isn't a war. It's a genocide. And I can't even imagine, this is so dastardly and disgusting to tell millions of families, yeah, just separate and send your wife or your daughter or whatever through this checkpoint. Maybe you'll see them again. Maybe we'll execute you. Who knows? But yeah, you send them out. It's just so crazy. And to have our mainstream media and our government acting like this is okay, this is humanitarian, this is the way to proceed, is just repulsive on repulsive on repulsive. Number 8, Rafah will be destroyed, leaving the entire Gaza Strip in ruins, and the Israeli-induced famine will worsen. 9, the Western media will continue describing Israel's genocide in Gaza in purely humanitarian terms, as though this was a disaster. The crisis continued, like these act of God phrasings they use. Number 10, under U.S. pressure, the International Court of Justice, or World Court, will be in no hurry to issue a definitive ruling on whether South Africa's case that Israel is committing a genocide is proved. Yeah, I mean, they won't answer that case for a year, 2 years. It'll be way too late. One last point here from Jonathan Cook's article. Meanwhile, Israel is already using the precedents it has created in Gaza and its erosion of long-established principles of international law as the blueprint for the West Bank. This guy and Consortium News have laid out what I think is a very possible plan for what Israel is doing in Rafah and in Gaza. We've heard these murmurings of these checkpoints that Israel's putting up, that they're surrounding Rafah, and it seems like this horror show is what's next.
I was talking to Ann Wright, and she's a former Army colonel, and she was telling me that you might have seen images of the so-called aid that the U.S. had dropped into the Mediterranean right off the coast of Gaza, and people have drowned trying to get to it. She pointed out that the U.S. has these GPS systems that they usually attach to these big pallets so that when they're dropped, they can be dropped in a very specific place. such as, oh, I don't know, a beach as opposed to in the middle of the goddamn water.
Mm.
But the US didn't use those GPS systems for this aid because they didn't give a shit. And maybe even they wanted these people to drown while trying to get the aid. So at every single supposed attempt to help people is bullshit. The US is the most powerful nation that the world has ever seen. And the idea that they can't even land pallets of quote unquote aid, which by the way, Anne Wright also pointed out, this is shit food, if you could even call it food. The idea that they couldn't land aid where they want to is just dumb. It's dumb. And you have to be a fucking idiot at this point to think that that's the case.